Welcome back, my friends. This is the second part of the Ukraine series video. If you have followed my first video in this series, you might get to know that here we will discuss some issues or factors internal to Ukraine that are needed to be addressed in order to put an end to separatism in Eastern Ukraine, because as some of you might know, pro-Russian separatism in Eastern Ukraine is a primary reason behind the building up all the circumstances which ultimately led to the situation as of now. I believe if separatism wouldn't have been there in the first place in Ukraine, this Russian invasion of Ukraine might have not taken place. So this is a very well researched video. It is full of facts, figures and stats. So I will not take guarantee that you guys would not get bored in the process. But if you watch this video fully till the end, then I can really guarantee that your knowledge about Ukraine will definitely enhance. Especially your understanding about the whole Ukrainian conflict will acquire more clarity. Now let's get started. The issue that I am going to discuss are neither related to NATO, nor to the US, nor to Russia even for that matter. It is about Ukrainian internal problems. It is about how ethnic Russians are being treated by Ukrainian establishment. For those who don't know, almost 30% of Ukrainian citizens speak Russian as their first language, and 17% of Ukrainians identify themselves as ethnic Russians. They are in majority in Crimea, which is about 65%, which is now under occupation of Russia, but they have a sizable population in eastern Ukrainian districts like Luhansk and Donetsk. Most of the ethnic Russians in Ukraine are the descendants of the Russians that are settled in during the 19th and early 20th century, who came here to work as industrial workers in the newly founded industries. And also another large-scale migration of ethnic Russians took place to populate the region, which got extremely depopulated after the large-scale death and destruction caused by World War II. Because of these large-scale migration of ethnic Russians in recent history into Ukraine, today's ethnic Russians living in Ukraine share a great degree of connection with Russian people in various spheres or domains, like when it comes to their family ties, their cultural ties or religious ties, or even commercial ties with Russia for that matter. The regional divide between Russian-speaking people living in eastern Ukraine and ethnic Ukrainians living in the western Ukraine is also very well reflected in the Ukrainian political divide, where eastern Ukrainians often vote for those candidates who are more pro-Russian or pro-Russia, and western Ukrainians often vote for those candidates who are mostly pro-West or pro-European Union. Giving you an example, the former Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych, who belonged to the Donetsk region of Ukraine, elected as president in 2010, he was seen as very pro-Russian, and most of you might know that he was the one who refused to come to an agreement with the European Union, which would have made Ukraine a part of the European Union. And instead, he opted to make commercial agreements with Russia, which suits Russia's commercial interests. This was the main reason behind the popular Euromaidan protests of 2014, which overthrew Yanukovych, and these protests mostly had Western Ukrainians participating in them, who wanted Ukraine to join European Union and also were frustrated by the Yanukovych pro-Russian policies. So you can get the idea of how polarized Western and Eastern Ukrainians are in important political matters. So given the polarized situation in Ukraine, it becomes urgent for the current Ukrainian government to cater to some legitimate concerns of Eastern Ukrainians. The Russian language official status, the rising tide of radical nationalism in Ukraine, some amount of regional autonomy, and finally the commercial ties with Russia. So these are some primary demands, or let's say concerns, of Eastern Ukrainians, especially those who live in Donbas region. Let's cover these issues one by one. In 1994, a referendum took place in the Donbas region, with 90% of the participants supporting the Russian language to gain an official status alongside the Ukrainian language at the national level, and the Russian would be the only official language at the regional level. The pro-Russian regime under Yanukovych decided to extend this official status to the Russian language in Russian language dominated regions. But when the pro-Western or pro-European Union government came after Ukrainian revolution of 2014, they repealed the regional language law. Let me ask you viewers, don't you find it as a grave injustice? In India, every state has the right to choose its own official language, and the language chosen is mostly the widely spoken language in each state, and we never tried to impose a single language on any of the states. We always knew that the optimal level of federalism and taking care of legitimate regional interests always strengthen the unity of the country rather than weaken it. Carrying on, not only pro-West governments didn't allow regional languages to gain official status at the regional level, but a pro-Western government also passed a law in 2019 which made it compulsory for all the newspapers, national television programs, books, magazines, etc. to publish a great amount of their content in the Ukrainian language. On the top of all that, a new law was passed which made it compulsory to use the Ukrainian language as the only means of instruction to study almost every subject at every level above primary education in all the public schools. Now, after looking at these facts, I am not really surprised that in a country where a language which is spoken by at least 1/3 of the population, which has its space continuously shrinking, especially after 2014, became a major issue of concern in the Eastern Ukrainian region. And the discontent with regards to the treatment of Russian language by the Ukrainian government helped in fueling separatism in the Donbas region. Because the thing is, the separatist leaders themselves are using this crisis of Russian language to instigate ethnic Russians in order to make them rally for their cause of separatism. Moving forward from this issue, there is also a concern of far-right groups and ideology rising in Ukraine, especially around and after the 2014 Ukrainian revolution. An interesting thing is that far-right groups have the institutional support of the Ukrainian government. You may find it surprising, but it's a fact. Examples, whether when it's come to absorbing these far-right militias within the Ukrainian military establishment, as in the famous case of Azov Battalion, or giving state funding to these extremist groups in the name of so-called educational purposes, as in the case of funding far-right group C40. Or let's take leaders of far-right groups occupying some key positions in Ukrainian police force and parliament. I will give you some more examples of how these pro-West Ukrainian governments are catering to the far-right ideology. Recently, the Ukrainian parliament passed a law officially declaring two controversial World War II Ukrainian nationalist organizations as heroes of Ukraine, and at the same time criminalizing their denial of heroism. If you go through the history of these organizations allied themselves with Nazi Germany, fought against the Soviet Union, and even collaborated with Nazis in carrying out Holocaust. So these sort of developments in Ukraine in recent years, which strengthened the far-right groups there, really became a matter of concern for ethnic Russians, which really feared the rise of radical nationalism, which they believe that if these groups became too powerful, they will target ethnic Russians. And this fear is not baseless. Some far-right militias have been accused of various war crimes in the Donbas region of Ukraine. You might be wondering why pro-Western Ukrainian governments are supporting these far-right groups. This is because first, they helped to overthrow the pro-Russian government. Many far-right groups actively participated in the Euromaidan protests by fighting against the police force. And second, they actively helped Ukrainian military in fighting against pro-Russian separatists in Donbas region. So no wonder why the Ukrainian establishment is helping those guys. Because of this institutional support, they are becoming more influential and getting bigger. And now they also started to give proper combat training to young boys and girls. Many of them are children of age 10 or 11. And all this is happening in the name of preparing these children in order to defend their country. As long as these extremist groups are helping the Ukrainian government in their war efforts against pro-Russian separatists and now also against Russian military, these groups will not only be tolerated but will also be nourished by the Ukrainian government. There is another prominent ultra-nationalist group known as the Right Sector, the organization who claim that they are continuing the legacy of the World War Second era's Ukrainian nationalist organizations like OUN and UIA. As we have previously discussed, these groups collaborated with Nazis and participated in the Holocaust. As one of the separatist activists told protesters at Donetsk rally that the Right Sector guys are a bunch of fascists who will direct all their rage against innocent people of Eastern Ukraine and they will destroy them and make them their slave. According to a research conducted recently by Columbia University in 2018, in Eastern Ukraine, the growth of radicalism and nationalism is one of the top reasons that makes people in the Donbas region most anxious in the present. And now let's talk about the demand for regional autonomy by people living in the Donbas region. First, there is often a misconception among many that almost every person from the Donbas region want their region to get separated from Ukraine, either from forming an independent autonomous country or getting absorbed into the Russian Federation. But this is a complete exaggeration of the separatist problem. Yes, it is true that some of the residents of Donbas want their region to become independent from Ukraine, but the majority of residents either want some federal kind of arrangement or they want at least some kind of decentralization. According to a research conducted by Kiev International Institute of Sociology, only 31% of the Donbas population supported either gaining independence or joining Russian Federation. But the majority of them either wanted regional autonomy within Ukraine or want some kind of decentralization. According to the previously discussed Columbia University research, even not all ethnic Russians support separatism in the Donbas region. The research shows only 40%, which is a large number but not a majority at all, support separatism, and remaining 55% either oppose it completely or are uncertain about it. But the surprising thing is, decentralization is also a popular demand among ethnic Ukrainians. While the majority of ethnic Russians prefer federalism, the majority of ethnic Ukrainians prefer decentralization. So you may ask why some kind of regional autonomy is being demanded by both ethnic Russians and as well as ethnic Ukrainians. It has often been claimed that people of Donbas feels extremely alienated by the central Ukrainian government. The reason behind that might be that given the fact that Donbas is a greatly industrialized region dominated by coal mining, metallurgy and consumer goods production, the region prior to the 2014 conflict made almost 30% of total Ukrainian exports. Because of this great share in the Ukrainian economy, there is a popular belief among Donbas residents that they nourish the rest of Ukraine, but in return they receive relatively fewer benefits from Ukrainian government. In simple words, there is a perception thing among Donbas residents that the taxes given by them subsidize other parts of the Ukraine, but they themselves receive inadequate investment and subsidies by the central Ukrainian government. Very few might be familiar with the Minsk agreements. These were the international agreements which aimed to end armed conflict in Donbas region between Ukraine and pro-Russian separatists. And both Ukraine and Russia were signatories to these agreements. And in these agreements, there were mentioned series of measures that will be taken mostly by the Ukrainian government to ensure long-lasting peace in the region. These measures included decentralization, giving special status, allowing some level of the local self-governance, and also ensuring Russian language self-determination in Luhansk and Donetsk regions. In short, it's about giving some regional autonomy to Donbas region when it's come to managing their economic, social and cultural affairs. and that is not very different from the freedom that an average Indian state like say Uttar Pradesh enjoys from the Indian central government. But Ukrainian government failed to implement almost every promise made in this Minsk agreement. It is my personal opinion that if the Ukrainian government had implemented even some important measures of Minsk agreements, then the invasion of Ukraine could have been avoided. Moving on, as I have discussed earlier, Ukrainians in the western part of the Ukraine wanted to join EU, European Union. On the other hand, most of the residents of Donbas region wanted to join the Eurasian customs unions founded by Russia itself in 2010. Surprising thing is, according to the same Columbia University research that I discussed earlier, both ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians want Ukraine to become a member of this custom union. Almost 82% of ethnic Russians and almost 60% of ethnic Ukrainians said that they would like to vote for joining the customs unions with Russia, Belarus and Kazakhstan. But you may ask why this affinity towards Eurasian custom union is being displayed across the ethnic groups in the Donbas region. The answer lies in the close economic ties of the Donbas region with Russia. As I have told you earlier, the Donbas region's economy is mostly based on industries. About 22% of Donbas production is exported to Russia. So not because of the cultural affinity with Russia, but because of their own economic interests, they will prefer custom union much more than the European Union, because they fear that Ukraine, by joining European Union, can provoke Russia to restrict export from Ukraine, and as Donbas economy by some extent dependent on Russia, thus if commercial ties with Russia will cut off, it can result in large scale recession and loss of jobs in Donbas region. In the same research that I talked about earlier, make this concern even more clear to us, that how fear of losing jobs is so apparent among Donbas residents that here, during an interview with a separatist leader from Donetsk, he told the interviewer that if a particular city in eastern Ukraine will not appear pro-Russian enough, then Russians will stop buying goods the city produces, and in result thousands of employees will go out of jobs. So you can understand how economic interests also play an important role in this conflict. So with that, I have explained in this video some issues internal to the Ukraine which should be addressed by the Ukrainian government if they aspire for a long-term solution to the ongoing conflict. See, even let's say Russia made a ceasefire in the ongoing conflict and withdraw all its troops from the Ukraine, and then everything went to normal again. But if the Ukrainian government failed to address problems like the rise of radical nationalism, treatment of Russian language by the Ukrainian government, lack of decentralization and local self-governance in regions like Donbas, and last but not the least, the harm joining with EU might do to the industrial workers living in the Donbas region. If these problems were overlooked by the Ukrainian establishment, then it will do nothing but further fuel separatist tendencies in eastern Ukraine, and anybody who knows some history behind this whole Ukraine conflict will agree that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is caused as much by the separatism and internal discontent among people living in the Donbas region as it is by the national security concerns of Russia, which I have explained in my previous video, which you can see by clicking the link above here or here. One thing more before ending this video, some people still believe in the theory that Putin's invasion of Ukraine is just beginning. His goal is to establish the great Russian Empire by conquering every country which was the part of Soviet Union. To those people I will say, just look at the history of the Russia-Chechnya conflict and you will get the idea what point I want to make here. Chechnya is a very small region situated at the borders of Georgia, and there is a history of centuries long insurgency fought by the people who wanted to make Chechnya an independent region by breaking away from Russia. This more than a couple of centuries long conflict caused hundreds of thousands of lives from both sides. Many innocent civilians, Russian civilians, also lost their lives in a series of terrorist attacks, costing the Russian government a great amount of money. The point that I'm making right now, that if Russia really tries to conquer every former Soviet republic, then Russia has to confront many Chechnyas, possibly 15 or more, along its borders in every direction. Even the world superpower USA, after spending trillions of dollars, losing thousands of their servicemen in Afghanistan, and the end result of all of that was the complete destabilization of the whole region and coming back of the Taliban, as we all know. I really doubt that any country leader, doesn't matter how authoritative he or she is, will ever invite such disaster on their fellow country citizens. Nobody wants to see their country needlessly suffering from many wars, insurgencies and terrorism. On that note, I will like to end this video here. Please share your thoughts on the whole Ukrainian conflict in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you enjoyed this video, you can like this video and share it with your friends. And if you like my content, please subscribe to my channel. We will soon meet again. Until then, take care of yourself and your family. Dhanyavad, goodbye, thank you and namaste.